Willkommen in einem anderen aufregendes Video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 5 of my Napoleon War series of training videos. In this case, we'll be covering combat, zones of control, and other miscellaneous rules. Napoleon at War is a series of board games published by SPI back in the 1970s. This is a figure game version of those rules, although I must admit they have been completely rewritten. Originally I thought this game system was so simple and no training videos were required, but as I've been forced to add a figure gaming flavour to the rules to keep my Napoleonic comrades happy, I now feel it may be useful to provide some basic training videos. This is based on my version 2.2, and incidentally the versions include no basic game system changes. All the changes are really basically typos, clarifications, and of course adding figure gaming bling, which is not even required to play the basic game. For those who wish to download a copy of the rules, you can do so from my Kriegspiel.io group site, or alternatively, if you want to create your own set of rules based on these rules, download the original SPI board game and create your own rules based on the play testing that I've been conducting over the last almost year. The rules are up to version 2.2, but the changes only consist, as I've indicated before, on concerning clarifications to the existing rules and also adding things like additional bling, etc. We'll be starting with stacking rules. Now, stacking in these sets of rules, the figure gaming set of rules, is purely related to how many elements make up a unit. A unit can consist of 3 elements, with cavalry and artillery counting as 1.5 elements. This can occur in any combination, as you can see here. One of the optional rules that I've included is the Grand Battery rule, which is designed to keep the Grand Battery fans happy. The French and Austrians can form a single Grand Battery, which consists of 3 artillery elements. Now, after playtesting the rules quite a bit, particularly playtesting the Deutsch Vergraben scenario, you can create Grand Batteries without this rule, but nonetheless, here's one bit of bling that you could put in if you so desire. Now we'll move on to zones of control. And this is one of the main basic game system changes that I had to implement from the SPI board game rules in order to allow it to work with figure games, specifically to eliminate hexes on the playing area. Every element has a movement zones of control which extends half the base width in all directions, as you can see here. A movement zone of control affects enemy movement. As soon as an enemy unit touches one of your friendly movement zones controls, its movement stops, apart from a simple wheel, which we'll look at later. As long as the gaps between movement zones of control are not greater than a base width, they can form, or you can form, a front line which elements cannot move through. In this case, the unit ends its movement as soon as the corners touch an enemy movement zone control, as you can see here. This allows you to defend in the same manner as the original board game without the use of hexes. Of course, if a player leaves a gap of more than one base width, 4 centimeters in this case, then a unit can move through it. This would be an error for a player to allow. Now, if you're using the optional command control rules, the commanders can exert a movement zone of control. A commander by itself has a zone of control, or a movement zone of control, and it can stop enemy units from moving, but as any combat against it would result in it being automatically eliminated, this is unwise. In this case, the attacking unit would attack both the commander and the element on the left. The commander is automatically eliminated irrespective of the final result of this combined attack, so this would be a silly tactic. We've completed movement zones of controls. There is another kind of zone of control, which is called combat zone of control because it affects combat. Once a phasing unit is within the movement zone of control of an enemy unit, it possesses a combat zone of control. A combat zone of control extends 1 base width in all directions. This is unlike movement zones of control, which only extends half a base width. This is 1 base width. And every enemy unit within a combat zone of control must be attacked during the phasing combat phase. In this example, all enemy elements are within the combat zone of control of the center white element, and that element must attack all these enemy elements. Let's look at an example. The white elements are owned by the phasing player, and it's the combat phase. All enemy units or elements within a phasing combat zone of control must be attacked, and all friendly units or elements within an enemy movement zone of control must conduct an attack. How you do this is entirely up to the phasing player. In this example, every single element has to attack every other opposing element in some way, shape or form. In this example, the phasing player will use Unit A on the left to attack the opposing Unit X and Unit Y, which is the dark units on the left of the screen. Unit B, the white B, and Unit C will combine to attack enemy element Z. Units D and W face off against each other. A player may wish to do this to break through the centre, while they do not care so much about being forced to retreat on, let's say, the left flank, which is probably very likely. This shows the likely results of such a combat. The attacker loses the left flank combat and retreats, as you can see here, Unit A. It wins in the centre, and as a result, Unit Z advances after combat, with Unit B staying where it is. And in D, it gets a lucky die roll and also wins that, so the enemy dark unit retreats and Unit D advances. Let's look at an example from a game. In this case, all the elements in the red box are attacking the unit at the top. The artillery at the back can attack because it can attack over a certain range, which we'll discuss in the artillery rules. But all the units in the front, the 3 units in the front, are all within the combat zone of control of the unit to its front, the white unit, the Austrian unit. As you can see by the die roll, it did not do very well. This shows a more complex example, and I'm not using movement trays in this example. In this case, all enemy units in the phasing player's combat zone of control are being attacked. There is not much choice here, but once the units get interleaved with each other, it gets a lot more complex. So what you can see here is that the units on the bottom of the screen, the Austrians and also the Prussians, are attacking the French to the top. Basically, each unit attacks the unit directly to its front. There is one unit there which is attacking 2 units because it has no choice. And of course, on the extreme right, you've got 2 single element units attacking 1 French cavalry unit. Now, let's address combat. All enemy units in a phasing combat zone of control must be attacked, and all phasing units in an enemy movement zone of control must attack. How a phasing player does this is entirely up to that player. Artillery is a special case which we'll deal with later. Let's now look at combat strengths, both for attack and defence. The combat strength of a unit is determined by the elements within the unit. In the standard game, one element has 1 strength point for both attack and defence. So in this case, we have 2 elements attacking 2 elements, which, if using the standard rules, means both units have a combat strength of 2 strength points. If we are using the optional rules, the combat strengths can be modified in some situations listed here. Cavalry against artillery and skirmishers are generally doubled, and skirmishers have a combat strength of half a strength point for both attack and defence. If we are using the optional troop quality rules, the combat strengths of elements can be doubled or halved based on their quality. So guard elements are doubled for both attack and defence, elite are only doubled for attack, raw elements attack strength is halved, and so on. In most cases, elements will have an attack and defence strength of 1. It's only these exceptional quality units that will differ. There are a number of other minor combat rules to note. A unit's combat strength is unitary, that is, it cannot be split. A unit can attack more than one enemy unit, and more than one unit can attack a single unit. The final combat strength modification is related to terrain. Attacking across streams or up slopes will double the defender's strength. Attacking defenders in built-up areas or woods will also double the defender's strength. We will cover terrain in more detail later on. Let's now deal with the actual combat process. Combat uses an odds-based combat results table. The attacker totals all attacking strength points and compares this with the defender's strength point total to arrive at an odds. Thus, 8 strength points versus 4 strength points results in an odd of 2 to 1. Fractions are ignored, so if you're attacking with 9 strength points against 4, it's still 2 to 1. The attackers spin a d6 and cross-references the die roll result with the odds column to arrive at a combat result. AE, or attacker eliminated, means the attacking unit or units are totally eliminated. That basically they are removed. The defender can advance after combat. DE, or defender eliminated, means the defending unit or units are eliminated. They are removed. The attacker can advance after combat. EX, or exchange, means the defender is eliminated, that is removed, and the attacker loses a number of attacking strength points equal to the defender's defense strength point total. Any surviving attackers can advance after combat. AR, or attacker retreat, means the attacker must retreat one base width. In some cases, this could be two base widths. The defender can advance after combat. If unable to retreat, the attacker is eliminated, that is removed. DR, or defender retreat, means the defender retreats one base width. In some cases, this could be two base widths if using optional rules. The attacker can advance after combat. If the defender is unable to retreat, the defender is eliminated, i.e. removed. A1, attacker loses one element, attacker's choice. If the unit is eliminated, the defender can advance after combat. This is an optional rule and is designed to provide some attrition in the combat process. It is normally combined with an AR result. D1, or defender loses one element, means the defender loses one element, the defender's choice. If the defender is eliminated as a result of this, the attacker can advance after combat. This is an optional rule and is designed to provide some attrition in the combat process. It is normally combined with a DR result. So far, everything I've covered is reasonably simple and straightforward. However, without hexes, the retreat from combat process can be tricky. This is about the most complex change in the game system, and it's important because failure to retreat or inability to retreat results in the unit being eliminated, so it's very important. There are a list of conditions which need to be followed when retreating after combat. A unit retreating can never enter a new enemy movement zone of control. This provides an example of how an enemy movement zone of control can affect retreat. On the right, the retreating element has to incline in order to avoid the new enemy movement zone of control. A unit retreating can never end its retreat in an enemy movement zone of control. In this example, the retreating element must retreat in such a manner as to avoid ending in an enemy movement zone of control. If it was retreated straight back, which is a valid retreat, it would end in an enemy movement zone of control. Thus, it must incline to the right to avoid this. Quick note, the reason why it can end theoretically in an enemy movement zone of control is because it started in the enemy movement zone of control. The previous restriction only applies to new enemy movement zones of control. A unit retreating must end its move at least half a base width distance from the final location of an enemy unit advancing after combat. Enemy units advancing after combat will typically occupy the former location of the first element of the defending unit. In this example, the retreating element could retreat to its side, that is, to the right of the screen here, or directly back. Both are valid. If it went directly back, it only needs to move one base width. If it moved to the side, it would need to move 1 1/2 base width, as when the enemy advanced after combat, it would need to remain half a base width away from the enemy element or unit. The retreating unit's player can choose any valid retreat path, even if it means the retreat move is more than one base width, as in this example. A unit retreating must never move further into an enemy movement zone of control it currently is in. Retreating units can slip out of an enemy movement zone of control which it's in, but it must never move closer into such an enemy movement zone of control. In this example, if the white element retreats to its rear, it would be moving closer to the enemy unit on its left. This is not permitted, so it needs to incline. In this case, it has moved further than one base width in order to ensure it remains half a base width away from any enemy unit advancing after combat. A non-phasing unit basically a defending player's unit, retreating can displace friendly units in order to retreat. The displaced friendly unit must not be the target of an enemy attack if the retreating unit is non-phasing, that is, a defending player. This stops players displacing units which would be subject to enemy attacks after the attack which caused the retreat. In this example, the element retreating can displace the element to its rear because the element in the rear is not being attacked in this combat phase. A phasing unit, that is an attacking unit, which retreats after combat can displace friendly units in order to retreat. The displaced friendly units cannot be displaced if it means an enemy unit in a combat zone of control cannot be attacked. This stops players displacing units which would otherwise be forced to attack, more likely at very poor odds. This is a rather complex example, but if the phasing player, which is white, conducts attack A first and was forced to retreat, it could do so because combat B could be conducted by the unengaged element on the left. However, this is unwise because now the attack is being conducted at a lesser odd. However, overall it is a safer combination. If you decide to first conduct attack B and you happen to lose, and then the enemy player advances after combat, then Unit A attack, or the A attack, could not retreat and would be eliminated if forced to retreat. Conducting attack A first followed by B has its advantages and disadvantages, and the same in the reverse order. The order depends on how aggressive the white player wishes to be. Now we will address a special form of retreat, which is when units are surrounded. Units which are surrounded cannot retreat, or at least most of the elements in the unit cannot retreat. To be surrounded, a unit must have enemy movement zones of control against its opposing edges, with some restrictions related to how much of the edge needs to have a zone of control in order to count. In this example, both white units are surrounded and if forced to retreat would be eliminated. Surrounding is based on elements rather than units, so only elements which are surrounded are affected. In this case, only the top two white elements are surrounded, and if the unit was forced to retreat, those two elements would be eliminated, but the third element at the rear, which is not surrounded, would be able to retreat. As it is possible for enemy units or opposing units to be in base-to-base contact with each other as a result of advance after combat, the extent of the movement zone of control needs to be considered. On the left, the bottom white element is not surrounded. On the right, all elements are surrounded. Surrounding can be a rather complex concept when there is a high density of units. There are a lot of example diagrams in the example document players can download and investigate. In most cases, the cases I've listed here are all that players need to concern themselves with, but there are some very odd cases which are in theory possible, although unlikely to occur. Now we'll be looking at advancing after combat, which, while simpler than retreating from combat, do have its slightly tricky concepts as well. In principle, after an advance after combat, irrespective of how close you may have started against the unit which retreated, the unit advancing after combat must be half a base width away from the unit which retreated after combat. This shows an example of an advance after combat. The location the first retreating unit occupied is now occupied by the unit conducting an advance after combat. Or, to clarify, the first element of the retreating unit is now occupied by the first element of the attacking advancing after combat unit. Units which decide to advance after combat, and it should be noted advance after combat is optional, must remain in the movement zone of control of the unit which retreated. In this example, the grey unit retreats one base width and the attacker advances one base width. It ends half a base width away and is still in the movement zone control of the retreating unit. Notice it's now in base-to-base contact with the enemy unit to its side. This is the only way opposing units can actually come closer than half a base width to each other. This is a more complex example. The grey unit attacks the white unit and the white unit retreats one base width. The grey unit now occupies the location of the first element of the white unit while remaining, and when I say first I mean the top element, the element which is being attacked, and it remains within its movement zone of control. In this case, the grey unit has conducted a massive incline. Units which advance after combat must have room to deploy without displacing any other unit. If unable to do so, the unit may split. If still unable to advance without displacing other units, the advance after combat cannot occur. In this example, the attacking unit advances after combat with a unit to its side. In order to occupy the first enemy element's location, only two elements can advance after combat. A unit can be split in this manner, but I personally would never conduct this type of maneuver, and if you're using movement trays, of course it's not really possible to do so without a lot of fidgeting. Another reason why movement trays, while they're very convenient and speed up play, are not really optimal for these kind of detailed advances after combat. However, I must point out, this particular type of advance after combat is incredibly rare, and it would probably only occur in a very unusual circumstance. Units which advance after combat can ignore all enemy movement zones of control except that of the enemy unit retreating. In this example, the grey attacking player can insert a unit into the gap that you see where the arrow is, ignoring the movement zones of control of the enemy units to either side. This is a risky move, but there may be a chance of surrounding an enemy elements or unit if they in turn are forced to retreat. Thus may be worth it in some circumstances. The rules we've just covered are a real brainstream. Now we'll move into something simpler, artillery and bombardment. Artillery can attack and defend as per any other unit or element, but it can also bombard an element over distant, or enemy unit over a distance. A unit containing artillery can bombard an enemy unit up to 2.5 bases away. In most cases, this bombardment attack will be combined with a normal attack, as can be seen here. Terrain can block the line of fire, but as long as there is a valid line of sight between the artillery and the target, it can bombard that target. Units never block artillery bombardment fire. This shows an example of bombardment fire. The artillery in the centre bottom has woods to fire through if it wishes to bombard, so its LOS is blocked as a result. Let's now cover terrain. Terrain affects movement. Most of the effects have been covered in the previous movement video. This shows all the movement effects of terrain for reference purposes only. Terrain also affects combat, normally doubling the defensive strength of the defender. This lists all the combat terrain effects. If an element of a unit being attacked has more than 50% of its footprint on, let's say, a built-up area or woods or whatever, the entire unit is doubled. This also applies if the unit is being attacked in the rear or side. If there is a slope between an attacker and a defender and the attack is occurring up the slope, the defender is doubled. On the left, the defender is doubled. On the right, it is not, because the attack is not going up the slope. Attacking up the slope modifier only counts if all the attackers are doing so. In this case, the defender is not doubled. Streams are similar to slopes. If the attacking unit has to cross a stream to attack, then the defender is doubled. On the left, the defender is doubled. On the right, it is not, because the attack is not occurring over the stream, even though the defender happens to be on the stream. As with slopes, all attackers must be attacking across the stream for the defender to be doubled. On the left, the defender is doubled. On the right, it is not. We'll now look at night game turns, which are very common if reproducing historical battles. During the night, there is no combat and units cannot enter enemy movement zones of control. Units cannot leave enemy movement zones of control unless the player is conducting a strategic retreat, which only occurs if the player has lost and wishes to minimise the level of loss. Weather, on the other hand, is not that common, although in some historical battles it does occur. In fog or heavy snow, all movement is halved and artillery cannot bombard. In heavy rain, the attack strength of all units is halved. Some scenarios provide additional weather effects and also provide weather change rules. The victory conditions depend on the scenario. In the simplest system, a victory is based on the control of 3 objectives on the playing area. Only the attacker gains VPs and gains 1 VP for the first time a location or objective is occupied, and 1 VP if it occupies it at the end of the game. The objectives are placed on the playing area with 1 in the centre, 1 closer to the attacker on one flank and 1 further from the attacker on the other flank. This is a simple system and is only appropriate for simple ad hoc games. While the army morale rule is optional, it is a rather important rule. This rule is used in many of the SPI board games, and I personally now feel should be used in the figure games all the time and probably should not be optional. In simple terms, once losses reach a certain percentage of a side's start forces, measured in points, the army becomes demoralised. This affects their ability to attack. If losses continue and they reach another particular threshold, the army can collapse. These rules are not actually game system rules for play, but are pre-rules, that is, rules related to terrain deployment, etc. So let's look at terrain deployment first, and this will vary by scenario, but in simple terms, terrain deployment is based on players spinning die to determine how many terrain pieces are deployed, and then the players deploy the terrain pieces in an alternate fashion piece by piece. I personally feel this is rather complex, and a simpler system could be using a standard playing area with some modifications to the terrain by 1 player. Then the other player would choose the side to play for. The force mix schedule contained in the rules also depends on the scenario, but it is a simple system and quite a valid system to use for ad hoc games. This requires each player to spin a d6, which gives them a force mix in points. Based on the comparison between the 2 force mixes, the attacking and defending player is determined, and also the deployment is determined. This is a simple enough system to be useful. Also contained in the rule is a simple basic organisation. This is loosely based on the DBN basic organisation chart and allows a player to quickly form 12-point or core-sized formations for ad hoc games. The previous system, while usable, is a little bit too simple for me these days. The system which I'm increasingly using is to use the actual force mixes used in an actual major battle. This shows the French army in 1809 at Deutsch-Wagram. Each corps is shown here along with its points value included. Another idea I'm beginning to experiment with is using a card-based system where each player selects cards from a deck, one at a time, which allows them to slowly build up their force mix. These cards are based on, in this case, the Austrian TOE at Deutsch-Wagram in 1809. And so we come to a close of this reasonably long video, part 6 of my Napoleon at War series of training videos covering ZOCs, combat and other miscellaneous rules. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.